an innocent school. This is only part of the terrorists who were eliminated on Saturday. Terrorists exploiting Al-Tabain school as a base for their murderous objectives. Israel should be praised. We are today the vanguard of civilization.
But the international community has condemned the strikes, with China accusing Israel of going too far.
Civilians and civilian infrastructure should not be a target of major operations. This is a red line.
But despite the outrage, the US announced on Tuesday that it had approved the sale of $20 billion worth of munitions and equipment to Israel, including army vehicles and F-15 fighter jets.
The US, as the largest supplier of weapons, has enough influence over Israel. We hope that the US will take sincere and responsible actions to push Israel to stop its military operations in Gaza.
I urge the Council not to be led by Washington, which is only concerned with protecting Israel's interests and profits from the delivery of weapons to war zones.
This has been Matt Boyland with your TNT News Brief. I'll be back with more at the top of the next hour.
From national security to global corruption, this is the Muckrakers on today's News Talk, TNT.
Hey everybody, and welcome to the Muckrakers. Today is Thursday, August 15th. I'm your host, Taylor Hudak, joined by my wonderful co-hosts, Andrew Eborn and Basil Valentine. So during the next hour, we will deep dive into the U.S. maintaining its global military intimidation throughout the world on several fronts. But before we get into that deep dive, we absolutely have to discuss this latest Mpox outbreak, formerly known, of course, as monkeypox. And yesterday, as many of you are probably already aware, the WHO Director General, Dr. Tedros, had declared monkeypox a public health emergency of international concern. So this has led many people to wonder, is this going to spiral and turn into something similar to what we saw with the COVID-19 so-called pandemic? Or can we expect the reaction, the response that we saw in July or the summer of 2022? So we'll unpack all of that coming up. I want to thank both of you gentlemen for being here today. Looking forward to the discussion. And first of all, I'll just open it up to you, Andrew. Can you share with us and the listeners some of the key information that was given to the public yesterday, as well as today, this morning, with regard to this recent outbreak of Mpox?
Absolutely. And what I love about this program, we always provide more light and less heat on the subject. So we don't want to spread fear. And this is a topic I've been talking about for some time, and was warning that it was going to break in the media, and was predicting the sort of devastating headlines about, a massive attack. There's going to be lots of deaths and everything else. So let me try and put it into perspective. The WHO Director General, he basically says there's an Mpox, which used to be monkeypox, outbreak. He declared a public health emergency of international concern, the PHEIC, due to the upsurge in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and other African countries. And basically it followed advice from the IHR Emergency Committee of Experts, and they cited potential for further spread within Africa and beyond. Now, you might remember there's two clades. There's a clade 1, which is incredibly serious and does result in death, and clade 2, which is far more prevalent, but is not nearly as serious. Well, apparently, as with all these things, that this new strain is basically evolved, and now there's basically this clade 1b. And what that is, that's spreading rapidly in Eastern DRC and neighboring countries like Burundi, Kenya, Rwanda, and Uganda, primarily through sex. So people have got to be aware of that sort of stuff. When you look at the statistics, and I say lies and statistics, but this is what they're quoting. They say it's escalated significantly. There's been over 15,600 cases and 537 deaths. So a huge amount regarding this reported this year, which is surpassing last year's total. They're basically asking for an extra $15 million to support surveillance and response efforts and so on and so forth. The big key in all of this is look at the fact facts, have a look. There's lots of resources out there and so on and so forth. The usual sort of warning about don't be scared, just be practical.
Right. Good points there. Thank you for laying all that information out. I do want to just look to what had happened in 2022 when this monkeypox virus was first brought to the public's attention, at least on a global scale, because there was also a similar outbreak or concern of international international concern that was put forward by the WHO. And this followed actually a simulation that took place at the Munich Security Conference in March of 2021, in which they simulated a response to a potential monkeypox outbreak and that potentially spreading to other countries throughout the world. But what was very unusual about the 2022 outbreak, and again, this is not according to me, it's according to many public health professionals. One in particular is Dr. Christian Perron, also a former WHO insider, who said at the time I had interviewed him in 2022, he said that it was highly unusual the way this outbreak was presenting itself. So typically with monkeypox, if there were to be any outbreaks outside of Africa, it was usually single isolated cases. However, in 2022, there was a simultaneous spread to multiple foreign countries at the very same time. So I actually asked him, could there be genetic tampering of this virus? He said that was, of course, always a possibility. But traditionally, again, this infection was mild in humans and also difficult to spread from person to person. Usually you would have to be in prolonged physical contact with an infected individual to contract this virus. And he, in fact, said that he was very surprised by this outbreak in 2022. So it is interesting to see this now being brought forth to the public's attention once again, and it does raise questions as to, is there interference or manipulation with the viral strain? Basil, do you have any insights as to what may be going on here, and if people should really be trusting and putting their faith in what the WHO says, given their pretty poor track record?
Good afternoon, good morning to you all, wherever you are in the world. First of all, monkeypox, obviously the suggestion is that it comes from monkeys. Did it? We're told that AIDS came from monkeys and that coronavirus came from bats. It seems that they like this animalistic association with some of these viruses. The second point to make is that at least with Mpox, the symptoms are visible. I saw a picture of an unfortunate chap outside his hospital ward in the Congo, and his face is covered in dozens of tiny little pimples, hands and legs as well. So unlike the lurgy, the mysterious COVID, which you not only could you not see any visible symptoms, you had to take an extremely crude test to discover. You didn't even feel any symptoms and you could be infected. That was the unique thing about the whole COVID farrago. So very different in that respect. Those afflicted are very, very clearly obvious who they all are. Thirdly, the WHO did lose an enormous amount of credibility with ordinary people. I'm not sure they lost quite so much credibility in the international corridors of power with governments and intergovernmental organizations. But let's not be alarmist about this. At the moment, it is still isolated to only a few African countries. Symptoms are generally mild influenza-type symptoms. The worst of it appear to be these pimples that appear all over you. Fatalities are relatively rare, certainly in terms as a percentage of the total number of cases. So, yes, the WHO have made a statement. Apparently, there's hundreds of thousands of vials of vaccine on the way to Africa. Whether or not they're going to work, I don't know. Perhaps they'll make the situation worse. Who knows? I don't know whether they're mRNA vaccines. That information wasn't in the article I read. So let's just take a deep breath for the moment. I don't want to assume that this is dark forces already planning the next lockdown, the next, excuse for imposition of some kind of draconian martial law system on those of us in the West. What will be interesting to look out for is the degree to which the whole story is amplified by the shill corporate media. Now, in the case of the coronavirus, The Guardian, for example, and the BBC were talking up the dangers of the virus when it was still confined to one province in China. Plus, of course, we had that ludicrous footage of people falling down dead in the street as if this thing was, science fiction level of fatality. You only had to be infected and you were sort of dead instantly. So look out for the usual suspects bigging it up and saying, we've all got to be aware and we've all got to do this, and stoking the fear. At the moment, I haven't seen too much of that, which is a good sign. And let's also remember that there are some good people working for the WHO and for these health organizations, and their aim will be to contain and eliminate the virus in Africa. They're not all actually in the pay of some, evil Skeletor, and this is all just an excuse to try and infect the rest of the world with this stuff. So that's my take on it at the moment.
Yeah. A couple of interesting points on that, Basil. And as you say, what we don't want to do is scaremonger. I always say that history repeats itself because we don't learn the lessons from history. And what we don't want to do in the media is to do that. The reassuring thing is that I was, as I say, commissioned some time ago to look at this because there were reports that it was coming out. And just trying to put it in perspective, let's look at the stats. Let's also not spread misinformation, because I'm not a virologist. Well, none of us are. So we work on that basis. We need to talk to the experts. So having a look at that. But basically what Mpox is, which used to be monkeypox, they did this whole rebranding. It's a cousin of the smallpox virus. It's most commonly found in Western Central Africa. There has been an increase of some cases in the UK. It was actually first discovered in 1958 and was monkeys which were kept for research in Denmark. So that's where it actually started, apparently. And the first human case was reported in 1970 of a 9-month-old boy in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Types, so they're basically
sorry to interrupt, Andrew, but if it was originated in a lab in Denmark, how come the first case then originated in the Congo?
I know, it's extraordinary, and I haven't had that transition. Why it would be a 9-month-old person? And this is what they said. They discovered it in a lab. Now, whether the bits of research and so on and so forth, 1958, and obviously there's those 12 years from 1958 to 1970 before you had these sort of things. But there are two clades. You're going to hear this narrative, which is why it's important that we set it out on the Muckrakers, because we can help that all make sense. Clade 1, which is really very, very severe and has a higher mortality rate, it leads to about deaths in about 10% of people, and that's predominantly found in Central Africa. But Clade 2, which is the one Taylor mentioned about this outbreak starting in 2022, that was of Clade 2, which is generally less severe. 99.9% of those who get it recover, and that's mainly found in West Africa. And basically you get these sort of symptoms, flu-like symptoms, fever, headache, muscle ache, and so on and so forth, swollen lymph nodes. It basically spreads from person to person. I talked about sex, but also touching the skin and kissing can also do that sort of side as well. Handling certain animals in dangerous areas, they warn about that sort of stuff. And they also talk about bedding and towels and not using general stuff. It's not the end of the world. If you do have any of those symptoms or you're a little bit concerned, do check out on some of the websites and go and seek medical advice, because we're not experts. What we can do, we can look at the information, double check it as much as we can, but this is evolving, and as we said at the very beginning, let's make sure that ignorance is not a big thing that leads to panic. We don't need to panic. We need to be realistic, look at the stats, but I can guarantee that this narrative about the new Mpox is coming is going to dictate the headlines for a number of days to come.
Well, I hope you're
now,
right.
Basil, you had mentioned, before I get you in on here, Basil, I do want to point out the WHO's history, because you mentioned that we should be careful not to push that this is necessarily some dark, evil agenda. But whenever I see the WHO trying to push vaccines on vulnerable populations, whether it be recently with polio vaccines on those in Gaza, or now with pox vaccines with those in Africa, it does give you a feeling that is very, very deeply unsettling, I would say, because of the WHO's history. In the past, this has been well documented. There's a documentary about it. It's called Infertility, A Diabolical Agenda. I would encourage people to check it out. And it outlines this very sinister agenda where the WHO had pushed vaccines onto the populations within Africa. And these were specifically tetanus shots that included the HCG hormone, that's a pregnancy hormone. And by including these in the tetanus vaccines without consent, without the knowledge of those who took the vaccine, what happened is that those individuals then developed an immune response to the HCG hormone and therefore were unable to have children. That is accurate information, not speculation, well documented. That is absolutely disturbing, unsettling, it's criminal. And I think that because of this, and that's just one small example of the WHO engaging in nefarious activity, the fact that this had happened, I think the WHO has forfeited its right to any public trust based on this fact. And again, I would encourage the viewers to check it out for themselves. There's a documentary that I had mentioned. So I just wanted to share that with the listeners. Basil, I'll hand it to you and then we'll cut for a brief break.
Well, indeed, the AIDS outbreak in Africa is traced back to a previous WHO vaccination program as well. What I meant really was from the point of view of containing it within the few countries in Africa where it's currently manifest, rather than the benefits of the vaccine program. I shared the story about this whole monkeypox farrago with friend and colleague Phil Zimmerman, and he immediately filed it in the bin without reading it, saying that it wasn't worth his time or energy. And though I don't want to sound like an ostrich, I think all of us, we could do worse than simply saying that a monkeypox pandemic in Europe, North America, or anywhere else is simply not going to form any part of my reality this year or next year. I don't want to seem like an ostrich, but I'm not.
Don't introduce ostrich pox. That'd be even worse. The ostrich pox is the most virulent form ever.
Right. All right, gentlemen. Great discussion. We will, of course, be continuing to look into this issue, keep you updated on any relevant developments related to this monkeypox outbreaks here on the Muckrakers on TNT. But we do now need to cut for a short break. When we return, we will deep dive into U.S. foreign policy. We'll have a full discussion on that when we return. You're watching the Muckrakers on TNT.
She used to dance and dream of a better life, a brighter future, with nutritious food to eat, a chance to learn, to get an education, and do incredible things. Today, thanks to Children International and friends like you, she dances for the world. Together, we give children in poverty a chance to set their sights high and achieve their dreams by ensuring that they have access to healthcare, education, life skills, and more, so they can grow, thrive, and believe in themselves.
Gracias. Gracias.
Learn more about Children International and join us in our life-changing work at children.org today.
The Light is Britain's far-right conspiracy theory paper spreading hate and vicious lies. No, that's what the BBC say. The Light is the only national newspaper bringing you the real news and informed opinion on what's really going on today. You can subscribe, order copies, submit articles, and read back issues on our website, thelightpaper.co.uk, and see for yourself why the establishment are so worried about the uncensored truth getting out to people every month. The Light Paper. Not for right, just right so far. Thelightpaper.co.uk.
From national security to global corruption, this is the Muckrakers on today's News Talk, TNT.
All right, everybody, thanks for sticking with us. We are now going to put our focus to the United States foreign policy, first looking at some new developments coming out of the U.S. relationship with Israel. There's been a recent report, it was actually announced on Tuesday, that the Biden administration has agreed to sell $20 billion worth in weapons over to Israel. And I've also seen in this report that this material is not expected to arrive until 2026 at the very earliest, which has me wondering, okay, what does that mean for any peace deal, any negotiations? Should we expect this conflict, or this genocide rather, to continue on in the region? Basil, I'll hand it over to you for an analysis on this particular report and what this means for U.S. relations in the Middle East.
Well, it's more of the same, Taylor. It's really very depressing that in spite of having already dropped 5.5 times as much ordnance on Gaza as was used for the destruction of Hiroshima by an atomic bomb in 1945, it seems the Israelis still want more, thousands more huge bombs. being delivered, as well as tens of thousands of rounds of ammunition and tank and artillery shells. So that all are destined for Gaza. Of course, much of it is destined for a potential war with Iran, which still stands on the precipice of retaliating for the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh. There were articles published in the Israeli newspapers, for example, talking about, can we be sure of America's support if we attack Iran, but with no discussion of why Israel might want to attack Iran, or indeed why Iran might be about to retaliate for the assassination on their own soil. The simple fact is that at the moment, and regrettable though it is, the United States and Israel are joined at the hip. You only get the mildest rebuke. And that's from a Democratic White House. Donald Trump said recently that if you're Jewish, you must be mad to vote for Kamala Harris. It was a really bizarre statement, given that more than 40,000 confirmed fatalities, tens of thousands more, injured and mutilated, 10 Palestinian children every day since the start of the conflict in October have had one or both legs amputated. Just really one of the worst reflections on humanity imaginable. And many of those carried out, if not most of them, without anesthetic. It doesn't really bear thinking about. So it doesn't bear thinking about, to me, that another huge tranche of weapons is heading to this tiny pyromaniac, homicidal maniac state so that it can bomb Yemen, Lebanon, Syria, Gaza simultaneously. And now it wants to add Iran to that list. It might well add Iraq as well, because in spite of having been very much behind the toppling of Saddam Hussein, needless to say, the Iraqis aren't on board with the Zionist project, so they might have to come in the crosshairs again. I snigger, but it's just off the charts, abysmal. The problem as well is that at home, the United States for this century has increasingly become a war economy. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, the major arms manufacturers, are the only ones really making any money. The rest of the manufacturing economy has been hollowed out. And whereas in the past, empires were built on a wealth of energy extraction and manufacturing, now in the United States in particular, you've just got this trillions of dollars of totally unrepayable national debt, falling living standards for ordinary people, and yet at the same time, this literally insane war machine, which is the only thing that's sort of keeping the country going in some completely distorted sort of way.
Andrew?
Yeah, very interesting, and seeing this sort of stuff. What I found particularly interesting about this story is the timing, because as you say, the Biden administration has approved a substantial $20 billion, that's $20 billion weapon sales to Israel, and that includes F-15 fighter jets and air-to-air missiles. But the deliveries are not expected to start basically as late as 2026. 2026. So we're in 2024 at the moment, hoping for a ceasefire, hoping sort of a peace to be brokered and so on and so forth. But they're delivering weapons all the way up, which may not be deployed until 2026. It's a complete nonsense. And you had Trump in that glorious bromance, which he had with Elon Musk, and a little interview there saying, well, what happened in Afghanistan? Well, they ended up with lots and lots of weapons, which they've been supplied, and they're now flogging them off and making lots of money as a result of it. So for me, I think the whole timing of these deliveries raises all sorts of questions. But Biden, I've made this point beforehand, Biden wants a legacy. He wants to turn around and say, well, hang about, he's sorted out this conflict before Donald comes trumpeting into the White House and claims a sort of victory. So I think we need to look at that sort of stuff. But having a look at the timeline of delivery, I did a bit of deep dive into this. 2026 is what they're saying. Tactical vehicles and around 50,000 high explosive mortar cartridges. That's when they're going to be delivered. 2027, over 32,120 millimeter tank ammunition cartridges. And 2029, they're looking at approximately 50 F-15 fighters and related modifications. That's costing about 18.82 billion. But that's 2029. So when people are sort of turning around and say, what's happening? Maybe they would argue, I guess, that they're going to make sure that things are secure. They're going to have all these weapons to make sure it never happens again. But within all of this, I don't see anybody's properly talking about peace. They're talking about how many more weapons they're going to keep supplying them.
Yeah, and on the topic of weapons, I just want to make note of it's absolutely heartbreaking reports that I saw on social media. I doubt that the mainstream Western media will even touch on this, but there was a report of a Palestinian man. His wife just had their twins, newborn children. They were just a few days old. He went to go register their births. And unfortunately, upon return or while he was away, he learned that his entire family, including these newborns, were murdered in an Israeli airstrike or Israeli strike. And it's just a heartbreaking story. You could see the video footage of his reaction, the photos of these newborns. It's just absolutely devastating. And U.S. taxpayer money is funding all of this. And I think that if the majority of Americans were aware of this, if their media did a proper job and reported on these tragic stories and the truth here, people would be so opposed to sending more money. Do you agree with that, Basil?
I'd like to think so, but the deaths are just a few of the countless tens of thousands, but they're emblematic of the systematic dehumanization of the Palestinian people. You see, there are voices even within the Israeli cabinet who would say that those newborns deserved to die because they could grow up to be terrorists. It's as simple as that. And unfortunately, that attitude also pervades in the corridors of Congress on Capitol Hill. They don't regard Palestinian lives as being of any meaningful worth whatsoever, let alone the equivalent of an Israeli life. Now, that's the result of decades of propaganda, of painting all Palestinians as terrorists, framing Palestinian resistance to occupation as terrorism. Words fail me, quite frankly, because it's such a dark place we're in. I mean, in terms of the American foreign policy, sending £20 billion worth of weapons to Israel is the clearest indicator yet of the total failure of American policy over the last 25 years. You can go back to the lies about 9/11, who actually committed it, what that was all about, which resulted in a war in Afghanistan, killing hundreds of thousands of people who had absolutely nothing to do with 9/11. I saw an estimate recently that in America's 9/11 wars, many of which were driven by Israel, let's be honest about it, 1.3 million people have died. 1.3 million people have died in America's forever wars in the 21st century. Iraq was based on lies. Saddam Hussein had no weapons of mass destruction. 100% fabricated, no accountability about that, no accountability for the politicians that told the lies, no accountability for the media talking heads that amplified them. So we've ended up with this rolling empire of lies that now results in the genocide of the Palestinian people and the brink of World War III. It's just absolutely abysmal from start to finish. We ought to be talking about the Middle East becoming a demilitarized zone. We ought to be imposing a total arms embargo on Israel, which has already been defined as plausibly committing genocide. So all the arrows are pointing in the wrong direction at the moment, I'm afraid.
And I think it is interesting, Basil, just picking up on this, is a point we often make here, is that we are the media at TNT. We do shine a spotlight on these issues and will continue to do so. Well, what I find abhorrent, and I witnessed your appearance on another show on TNT a little while back over a weekend, where you were basically saying all of this. We're pro-peace. We want to stop the slaughter of innocent people, of civilians, of women and children, and complete devastation. And as soon as you start raising these humanitarian points, is about let's find the road to peace, you're labeled as anti-Semitic, you're labeled as it's outrageous, you're a pro-Hamas supporter, and I find that absolutely abhorrent. I had a Oh, go on. It's a bit of an echo there. I had the joy of, and it was the joy of having a very sensible discussion on both sides of it, very measured discussion, where a lot of people actually, somebody called Richard Pater came on the show. He's based in Israel. And he actually said, look, about more than 50% of people in Israel don't support Netanyahu. A lot of people want to get the hostages home. They want to find peace and so on and so forth. What we have to do in the media, we have an obligation basically to present the truth and also not to basically inflame the situation, all for a bit of clickbait. And I thought the way that you were treated out is firstly disrespectful for you, but it also did a massive disservice to humanity generally, because all it did was try to get clickbait and inflame the situation. What was your view, Basil, of your experience?
Well, there were a number of things I wish I'd had the chance to say, but didn't get a chance to say. That was, my immediate feeling when I came off air. It was 2-1, Roger Gewolb and Bishop Kai Dewar. So I was a little bit frustrated, but, I felt I gave a good account of what was really only a rational humanitarian position. I wasn't, fervently advocating on behalf of Hamas, anything like it. Probably get arrested if I would. Remember, they're a terrorist organization. I was just trying to make the case for peace and for the slaughter to stop. And also, pointing out some of the, the long-term issues. Israel just yesterday announced yet another settlement building plan in the West Bank. Now, it was only a couple of weeks ago that the ICJ ruled that the settlements of the entire occupation is illegal under international law. But who is going to remove the existing settlements, let alone stop them building any more? The fundamental iniquity of the situation is that both British, American, European foreign policy is all based on this mythical two-state solution mantra, which is in fact very dishonest. It's duplicitous because the Israelis have explicitly ruled out a two-state solution. They've made that very, very clear. So therefore, if there's to be a two-state solution, their position has to change. It's not going to change voluntarily. Therefore, they have to be forced to change it. The only way they're going to be forced to change it is by imposing sanctions, arms embargoes, but also economic sanctions, crippling economic sanctions of the kind that were imposed on South Africa. Is that going to happen? No, we're seeing quite the reverse, 20 billion pounds in weapons. So, until the West decides to remove the diplomatic cover from Israel, treat it like any other country, then I'm afraid the situation's only going to get worse.
And also, don't treat the audience, the people who are watching at home. We talk about the blame in the media as say we are the media. What you have to do is treat the audience with respect. They know what's going on. When we're talking about supply of arms, let's look about when, what, why, how, and so on and so forth. And when you're talking about delivery years in advance, what does that tell you? And I think what we have to do, and I always urge this sort of point on the muckrakers in particular, is what we do. We always try and set out the facts and then set out our opinion on it. But the audience at home are incredibly intelligent. They're incredibly awake in the right positive way about it. Give them the facts and they will come up with their own views. And hopefully together we can make a difference.
Absolutely. Well said. I think we all very much agree on that. I think one thing that's very important to remember, of course, is that the public is intelligent. They can see for themselves what is truth from fiction. They don't need some sort of czar out there or commissioner within the EU, for example, to monitor their online speech or provide any of these warnings of what is truth or inaccurate information, which is what we're seeing. We discussed it earlier this week. But again, bringing it back to this conflict in the Middle East, there has been for a week or 2 weeks now concern about Iran retaliating in Israel. And there have been many reports of the closing of the airspace, or rather, various airlines have chosen not to fly over this region in fear that something could erupt in the area. Now, what is your perspective, Basil, on when we could perhaps see an escalation of conflict? I think some were assuming it was going to happen a little bit sooner or happen already. It has not yet, or at least on the scale that was being anticipated. So any indications of what we can expect in the coming days or weeks?
Well, as you say, a lot of people were expecting Iran to have retaliated already. Of course, the newly elected Iranian President Pezeshkian, he wants dialogue with the West. He wants to make peace. He wants, like the other countries, to have a family of peaceful nations cooperating with each other economically. And what happens at his very inauguration? A VIP guest is assassinated. I mean, it's very obvious who the aggressors are here and who wants peace and who wants war. He's been applying pressure to the supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, to be restrained in his response. Early on, Iran said it was going to hit Israel hard. Of course, that's meant that effectively you're talking these days about Israel/America. If you want to go to war with Israel, I mean, that's even a change since 1960s, 1970s, or even the early part of this century. Israel now expects the United States to give its full-throated support to any war it chooses to undertake, whether it's against Hezbollah or Lebanese civilians, for that matter, Syrian civilians, anybody at all it chooses to kill. It expects the United States to provide the weapons, provide the bullets, and provide the diplomatic cover. Now, the Iranians have been very restrained so far. They haven't done anything. Whether or not they launch a drone strike similar to the one that happened earlier this year in April, that's now considered to be the most likely outcome of this. It'll boil down to how many people get killed, whether any Israeli civilians are killed, and that will then determine the scale of the Israeli response. It's all very well to sit here saying nobody wants World War III, but I'm not sure if that's entirely the case. I think there are bad faith actors that want to see the Middle East go up in flames for some reason. I don't think they're necessarily in Tehran.
Right. Now, I was actually seeing many posts on social media. I don't know if either of you gentlemen had seen this, but there was video footage of the Taliban in Afghanistan staging a massive military parade of $85 billion worth of U.S. military equipment that was left behind by Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. I mean, it was quite unsettling and quite extraordinary, honestly, to see this. I hear you confirm, Andrew, that you have seen this. Any initial reaction to that, or if that could sway people?
I referenced
the policies there.
I referenced it just a few moments ago about what's happening with the continued supply of arms to Israel and so on and so forth. And Donald Trump mentioned it in his bromance interview with Elon Musk. He said, look, they're parading all these weapons and they're probably going to sell them back again now to different people around the world and make a lot of money. And I think this is what we need to look at. We need to keep revisiting these things because these stories do get buried somewhere in the narrative while we basically fix on something else in the media, whether it be Mpox or something else. It's the great distraction. As a wise man once said, what are we being distracted from? And you always have to ask those questions, because I always reference, if you like, that brilliant movie, Wag the Dog, if you might remember that, Robert De Niro and various others in that, all about, they basically staged a war. And they staged a war in order to create a distraction from a scandal at home. Well, boy, is fact representing and even more unbelievable than fiction in these days, when that's exactly what's happening. You're getting various other things where we're being distracted. And the suggestion that Netanyahu has so much to lose when the war stops, and hopefully it is when, and hopefully that's going to be soon, because then the focus will be back on him and the various things that he's got to answer to. But you look at these latest demands, this is what we need to keep doing. So who's the unreasonable one in all of this? So, and as Basil makes the point, well, what are those demands? So Israel, apparently the latest demands include maintaining indefinite military control over Gaza's border with Egypt and imposing travel restrictions on Gazans and moving beyond the previously agreed terms. Well, we need to look at all of that. Let's shine a spotlight on that. What is interesting, though, and we talk about retaliation because of the execution, the killing of Hezbollah and Hamas leaders. They were sort of talking about retaliation. Well, Biden was saying, look, if a peace deal can be reached, basically, then they wouldn't retaliate, because it's been a number of days now and so on and so forth. I'm very interested to hear both your takes on that.
Absolutely. I do want to point to Trump's speech from yesterday. It was a campaign speech. It was delivered in North Carolina, and I was really interested to see if he was going to make any reference to U.S. foreign policy and the state of affairs internationally. He did make some statements, but they were very brief, Basil. Basically, what he said was that we would not be in this situation, given if he were president for the past 4 years, that Russia would have never invaded Ukraine, that the attack on October 7th would have never happened if he were to be president. What do you make of that rhetoric? And would you hope, of course, to see that perhaps a presidential candidate would lay out some solid plans to the public about initiating peace or resolving these various conflicts in the world?
Yeah, I mean, what would have happened had he been president is totally irrelevant. We have to deal with the situation as it is, not how we would wish it to be. And also, unless there's a marked change in the mood of the American people, all the polls I'm seeing are saying that he's not going to be the next president of the United States, and therefore what he says thinks is completely and utterly irrelevant. His instinct is to be more of a deal maker, and I think he could probably achieve something where Eastern Europe is concerned. On the other hand, his record in the Middle East is pretty abysmal. So, I wouldn't expect much from him in that direction. In terms of what's happening on the ground out there at the moment, which is sort of more relevant, Brits have been evacuated from the Lebanon. The ceasefire talks are not going to include Hamas for the very reasons that Andrew outlined, because the Israelis keep moving the goalposts. And Biden, well, at the moment, his legacy is absolutely in the toilet. It couldn't be worse. He's presided over and funded a genocide, and yet, for some in America, that isn't enough. He hasn't gone far enough. I mean, it's completely off the charts. Some presidents like to leave office with a peace deal, particularly somebody who purports to be a man of the sort of reasonable centre left as Biden, but unless he's prepared to move mountains in the next couple of weeks, and now that he's a lame duck and not running again, there's much less incentive for the likes of Netanyahu to pay any attention to what he says, because he's going to be gone sooner rather than later. So therefore, while already senile, he's now also increasingly irrelevant. I don't think he's going to achieve anything in terms of a ceasefire, and thus preventing very possibly a major Iranian retaliation against Israel. But we'll have to wait and see.
Right. Very interesting points, especially given that he is not running for re-election. It does sort of alleviate some of the pressure on him. But we do need to cut for a short break. When we return, we will discuss the conflict in Ukraine, as well as the Ukrainian authorities or officials invading of Russia. We absolutely will get into that. All of those details coming right up on the Muckrakers.
I didn't ask to be thrown in the streets with nowhere to go. I didn't think I'd survive. But I did ask for help, and Covenant House was there for me.
1 in 10 young adults will experience a form of homelessness this year. For these kids who didn't ask to be put in this unthinkable situation, Covenant House is there.
Covenant House helped me break the cycle of homelessness in my family. They gave me the love that I needed.
Over 2,000 young people will sleep safely in a Covenant House bed tonight. When youth who are experiencing homelessness have a hot meal, a safe place to sleep, medical care, and love, they can overcome heartbreaking challenges and have a brighter future.
They just really genuinely just wanted to help me succeed, and I'm succeeding. I'm a speaker, I'm an author. Covenant House really helped me and really helped mold me into the woman I am today.
If you or someone you love is asking for help, go to safeplacetosleep.org today.
Meet Norm. He lives with anxiety, but with the help of this latest innovation from Be Normal, he can be normal, just like everyone else. With the swipe of a finger, you can project happiness, confidence, machismo. Why settle for being real when you can be normal? The Normal Maker. New from Be Normal. This item doesn't really work because there's no such thing as normal. We're all different. What we like, how our brains work. In fact, 1 in 5 of us live with mental illness. Don't filter who you are. Start by talking to someone you trust. And remember, there is no normal.
The Muckrakers are restless. This is today's News Talk, TNT.
Welcome back, everybody. All right, now focusing on Ukraine, there's actually a lot to discuss here, from NATO pilots being trained in Western countries, as well as U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham's visit to the region. We have lots of thoughts about that, of course, as well as Ukrainian officials or Ukrainian armed forces invading Russia. I'm going to hand it over to you, Andrew. Any initial thoughts on where we are with this particular conflict?
Okay, so let me tell you what. Let me tell you, I know Basil's got very strong views, but a great personal friend of Basil's, US Senator Lindsey Graham, what he's done, he's urged retired NATO pilots to volunteer in Ukraine to help fly these F-16 fighter jets, as Kyiv lacks sufficiently trained pilots. Well, we mentioned that here on the Muckrakers. Basically, there's no way that somebody can just deliver these F-16 fighter jets and somebody just be able to hop in the cockpit and off you go. It takes months, if not years, of training to do that. So, surprise, surprise. Graham's also suggested that retired pilots from NATO countries could be hired to support Ukraine until Ukrainian pilots complete their training. Well, we've been talking about the war dragging on forever, complete supplying weapons and so on and so forth. Maybe the training will be ready by 2029 as well. But we need to sort of look at that sort of stuff. But basically, Western nations, including Belgium, Denmark, the Netherlands and Norway, they've pledged to provide over 80, that's 80 F-16 jets to Ukraine, but the number of trained pilots is still inadequate for the reasons that I mentioned. And just finally on Volodymyr Zelensky, he's confirmed that the first F-16s have arrived in Ukraine, but it's unclear how many or if they are actually in combat as we speak. And just as I say, Ukrainian pilots are being trained now, apparently, in the US and Denmark. Ukrainian pilots in the US and Denmark, and they've only about 20 expected to graduate by the end of this year, half the number needed for a squadron.
Yeah, so all of us here have seen that speech that Lindsey Graham had given on Ukrainian soil. When I saw that he was there, I thought, oh gosh, this cannot be good. The reason I say that is because he has a history, is well known for always advocating for boots on the ground, escalating tensions. He's very hawkish. I think we all agree on that. So Basil, I'll let you weigh in on what he said and what this means for the United States, and also what message does this send to our adversaries?
Oh, you mean Lady G? That's his nickname in Washington, and I leave you to work out why Senator Graham, who's single, might be called Lady G. He's a homicidal psychopath. He hasn't seen a war yet that he doesn't like. He hasn't seen the dead body of one of his supposed enemies that doesn't get him excited, whether they're Russian or Palestinian. He revels in gore and slaughter. He's really the very worst example of humanity and should have no place whatever in public life. He described Ukraine's invasion of Russia, the Kursk incursion, as bold and beautiful, and he was apparently thrilled to see the destruction and the sight of the Russian corpses. And I think the less said about him and the sooner he disappears from public view, the better.
Okay. Strong opinions, but good analysis on that. Honestly, this is a view shared by so many Americans, especially those who are very anti-war. Now, I do want to take a look at this recent invasion of Ukrainian military officials into the Kursk region of Russia. When I heard about this news, I was somewhat surprised. Maybe I should not have been, but it seemed to not make much sense. I mean, what is Ukraine going to do? Conquer all of Russia? I mean, it's a huge country. Of course, the reports are stating that, according to the Ukrainian side, the goal is to use this region as sort of a bargaining chip to perhaps seek back those regions that Russia had taken over in Ukraine, perhaps. So it's like a bargaining tool. But Andrew, what are your thoughts on this? What did it mean? What was your initial reaction to this move?
Oh, it totally is a bargaining tool. It's humiliating for Putin to see the Ukrainian flag being flown in that particular area. And the whole world is sort of basically shining the sort of spotlight and saying, oh, hang about. The idea was to distract, if you like, to draw the forces away from Ukraine and to go and defend on their own territory. So the optics for that, but as demoralizing for Russia, it's demoralizing for Putin. And the whole idea, and I think you always have to ask why. Why are they doing it? Why did they do that? Why did they go these 20, 30 kilometers outside of Ukraine? Well, I can tell you it was to negotiate, because that's what's happened. If you negotiate from a slightly better position of power, it will force that negotiation. But you can guarantee that China, and we'll come on to Taiwan if we have time, China will be watching how we respond to Russia and Ukraine, because it's a similar sort of situation about Russia saying, okay, this is what we want from Ukraine. It's all about territory and what we're going to try and do. And then China will do a similar sort of narrative with Taiwan on that sort of basis. But absolutely, it's right to say that's what it is. It's a negotiating position. And the optics on this are very, very clear, pointing to that direction.
Yes. Now, a Russian official, I believe Dmitry Polyansky, had stated, and I'm quoting here, he said that those who thought that this barbaric attack will sow discord among Russians and scare them turned out to be completely wrong. He went on to also state that this was a criminal act that has only consolidated our society and showed the true colors of our enemy, that being, of course, Ukraine, as well as the support that Ukraine is receiving from the United States, who deserves nothing but a complete defeat and unconditional capitulation. So it seems that Russia is not going to back down, of course. I understand that, yes, the optics of this, it is quite embarrassing for Russia to have this happen. But unfortunately, as a result of this, it's being reported that 12 people have died and several others have been wounded as a result of this invasion of the region. Is that right, Basil? And what is your take on this and this escalation?
Well, it's not going to change the course of the war at all. In fact, it used up a lot of Ukrainian resources, so it may actually turn out to be something of an own goal. Yes, as Andrew said, it's a bargaining tactic, a distraction, a way of giving Vladimir Putin a black eye, but he's still going to achieve the knockout punch sooner rather than later. And most analysts are saying that, in fact, it will hasten Russia's victory. So it's obviously very unfortunate. Anybody gets killed in these situations, but it's not going to make any difference in the long run. Something else that's just come out in the last 24 hours, I think, well worth reporting on as well, is the Wall Street Journal, of all publications, reporting that it was indeed a Ukrainian sabotage team that destroyed the Nord Stream pipeline in a mission that was initially approved by Zelensky, apparently, was then cancelled, but then went ahead anyway. The Ukrainian officials have, unsurprisingly, denied these reports, but I do think it's significant that the Wall Street Journal are not pointing the finger at Moscow. They're pointing it in precisely the opposite direction. I wonder what the Germans have got to say about this, if it's their big allies, who they've been supplying with so many weapons and money and all the rest of it, have done this and basically kicked their benefactor in the you-know-wheres. So, perhaps it's a game changer, because the Wall Street Journal has always been very closely allied to the United States deep state. And they would have buried this report if it had been felt that it was, pointing in the wrong direction. So I gain some optimism from that this may be the beginning of the rug being pulled out from underneath the Zelensky regime by the West.
Yeah, and I do think, it's a very interesting point as well about, I think there's been a seismic change in the sort of waking up to, as I go on about the wonderful audience that we have, and not insulting their intelligence anymore, because they are questioning these things. We did a whole program and continue looking at it again about false flags, for example, and just what has happened throughout history. People say, oh, no, this couldn't possibly happen, until you start presenting the evidence. And it does mean that people are now a bit wiser. They're going in, rather than having their own petty prejudices, they're going in with their eyes wide open and say, look, what are the possibilities? Give us the facts. Don't try and hide things. We know that people got excuses and reasons for peddling a particular narrative, but we as the audience, we as the general public, have a right to know, and we're going to keep asking those questions. And that's what I know I bang on about TNT, but what I love about it, and what I love about the fact that we have so many hours that we can fill raising these questions, shining a spotlight where others in the past haven't, and now that's spilling out out into the mainstream media. And I'm seeing reports that we do here on the Muckrakers being reported again in a wider media, which just goes to show just how big we are in terms of that sort of a narrative, if you like, where basically we are a speedboat in an ocean of ocean liners, and long may that continue.
All right, quickly here, while we do have a few more minutes, Basil, I want to hand it over to you for some thoughts on Taiwan, because there are some somewhat interesting developments coming out on that front. So specifically, there was a report published just a few days ago in The Hill. It was by Joseph Bosco, who formerly served as China's country director for the Secretary of Defense in 2005 and in 2006. So quite several years ago. But in this opinion article, he had actually compared China's President Xi Jinping to Hitler. He also went on to state that the United States needs to have a stronger policy advocating for the protection of Taiwan. Any insights onto U.S. policy as it relates to Taiwan right now and also looking into the future?
Well, everyone's Hitler, of course, that you don't like. Saddam Hussein was Hitler, Vladimir Putin's Hitler, you name it. We had a feature called The Weekly Hitler on the Sunday Wire for some time, because it's just bandied around so much. But,
just on that, Basil, before you go, J.D. Vance called Donald Trump potentially the American Hitler. So we mustn't forget. So yeah,
that's right. Everybody's Hitler these days, but it's quite the fashion. But seriously, the problem the United States have got, of course, is that China will overtake it as the world's largest economy very soon. But China doesn't have natural resources. It doesn't have the oil it needs to keep its burgeoning industry going. Where does it get that oil? Mostly from Iran and Iraq. So there's this subtext to possible American involvement in a war in Iran, which would be that if the United States could gain control of Iran's oil fields, then it can suppress China. It can threaten to turn off the oil. It can control and contain China in a way that it wouldn't if Iran is allowed to continue in the BRICS axis. So that may well be what's behind this. And Taiwan, well, nobody really cares about it. It's just the inflection point. It's the tinderbox. It's the excuse, because, of course, the famous democracy. Remember, Taiwan is democratic and should be allowed to determine its own future. But of course, that's just indicative of America's double standards, because they don't apply them in the rest of the world.
Very good points. All right. That is all the time that we have for today. It's been a fascinating discussion covering a wide range of issues, monkeypox, also U.S. foreign policy. On that note, next week, the DNC, Democratic National Convention, will be held. I'm sure we're going to get into it on the Muckrakers, but be sure to not miss tomorrow's episode of the Muckrakers on TNT, hosted by Andrew Eborn, with special guests George Samueli and Martin J. So don't miss it, same time tomorrow. Thank you all for watching. Again, the Muckrakers on TNT.
Take care.
To hear a replay of this hour, go to episodes at tntradio.live. Now, TNT Radio News.
Back again with your hourly news brief. I'm Matt Boyland. US government whistleblower Deborah White has accused US President Joe Biden and his administration of aiding and abetting child trafficking and exploitation through their dangerous open border policies. Deborah joined 3 Republican senators in a roundtable meeting on Capitol Hill last month to raise the alarm over the government's alleged complicity.
Terrible doesn't describe what's happening. Illegal, not upholding the law. That is the basic duty of the president and the vice president and the heads of executive cabinets.
Yes.
That is the basic rule, is that you are to uphold the law and protect your citizens. And that is not what's happening. It's abhorrent